Hello, my name is Ron Miller. I'm with the United States Coast Guard, and I'm very happy to speak today about my thesis, which has been the last year's effort, and it's called Policing the Pacific, specifically an exploration of law enforcement capacity building and strategic policy options within the PIC countries, the PIC, and the FAS. So the reason I really wanted to talk about this topic, and I felt compelled to write about it, was from my background working in Guam, in Micronesia, and trying to work these IUU law enforcement and fisheries enforcement and just general law enforcement topics within the Pacific. I spent years working that topic, and I feel we could do better. So I felt compelled to write my thesis on the topic. So to kind of frame the background, I needed to explore threats. So in the Pacific, there's a number of growing problem spaces with great powers competition, and as globalization, technology, all kind of converge and intersect on the Pacific. So that my thesis explored things such as visa fraud, human smuggling, money laundering, cyber crimes, and specifically resource extraction and resource exploitation within the region. So when you kind of explore these threats, you start to then see, well, what policies is the US looking to enact or do we currently have in place? And you can see some pretty staggering policy gaps. So those policy gaps are kind of a result of when you look at the current major players that are influencing the strategic policy space in the Pacific. Those are the Defense Department, the DoD. So they're very focused on access and denial, pairing the battle space, preserving the Pacific as a region that is significant to U.S. national security and access and our partners in the region, and really focusing on this great powers competition that is starting to develop in the region. So then you switch over to the State Department, who's very focused on grants, democracy building, climate change, but the portfolio is so large and so complex that sometimes things like policing, law enforcement capacity building, and kind of just impacting the day-to-day lives of border enforcement, law enforcement is overlooked or missed. And then you have a whole kind of smattering of FEMA, USAID, and others that are all working this grant space, this capacity developing space, but they really don't have that law enforcement background or that law enforcement capacity mindset. So I needed to look elsewhere. So the thesis specifically explores Australia and the US actions in the Caribbean. So let me talk about that briefly. So Australia specifically has had a history, 50 plus years is where the thesis goes, of background developing law enforcement capacity within the Pacific Island region, the PIC. At keeping this concept called the arc of instability at bay. So the idea being this Pacific region is so intertwined with Australia and Australia's law enforcement, national security success, the investment in the region is critical. Specifically, when I looked at the Australian policy section, I really explored the Pacific Patrol Boat Program, which is a phenomenal investment of law enforcement and national security capabilities in the Pacific region. I specifically explored the Pacific Fusion Center that is coming online, in the idea of truly bringing together the Pacific Island region for information sharing, law enforcement, targeting, and tactics to try to get at some of these complex problems that are in the region. And then lastly, I looked at the Pacific strategy that is a larger Australian strategy for law enforcement capacity building. So this kind of looked at some of their actions for stabilization in the region or anything else that was law enforcement advisors, legal advisors, and a number of other things that have occurred. Then I moved into the Caribbean. So the Caribbean with the US specifically explored Joint Interagency Task Force South, which is part of Southcom, so it was really heavily intertwined. So this is a Southcom, JIATF South conversation, and looked at US intelligence, US operational tasking and queuing of assets within the region, and trying to combat and stem law enforcement problems in that Caribbean region. It also explored OPBAT, which is heavily intertwined with Southcom and JIATF South, but distinctly different because it's a true partnership with the Bahamas and trying to create these joint task force to work this law enforcement problem in the region. So here was the problem once I started to explore these two topics. How do I bring it all together back to the Pacific? So to achieve that, and I'm pretty happy about this model I developed, which was the law enforcement domain evaluative model. So the law enforcement domain evaluative model tried to give me a couple categories so I could objectively score those actions that Australia has done and the US has done in the Caribbean to try to overlay that onto the freely associated states in the Pacific. So specifically, I use categories such as oversight, governance, awareness, enforcement capability, and influence. And I gave those a scoring. So the idea being, we don't have to embark on one strategic policy to gain all of those categories to drive policing capacity in the Pacific. But with this multi-approached, so in Australia's, for example, the Pacific Patrol Boat Program, a fusion center, and a strategic policy governance document of capacity building. When you bring all those together, you start to get benefits on all fronts, and you start to work at this complex law enforcement problem. Ultimately, that conversation led to a series of recommendations. So those recommendations are designed to be a path for US policy, strategic policy. The first of those recommendations was to kind of broaden Joint Interagency Task Force West. So there already exists in Indo-PACOM this fusion center concept to try to facilitate this conversation in the region. So the second recommendation was the establishment of a Micronesian fusion center. So it may sound similar to JIADF West, but the difference is the law enforcement centric nature, and the idea being bringing in outside islands to both train, teach, and partner together to work both US law enforcement problems and Pacific Island problems at the same time. So within that, there needs to be some capacities or capabilities. So I specifically identified the digital forensics lab. So this emerging problem space is significant in the region, but it's also resource intensive. So how do we partner together to both build the capacity and make it available to US and Pacific Island problems? Next would be a DNA sequencing and chemical analysis team or staff, whether that's based in the Pacific Islands or whether that's a partnership agreement in the US, but it needs to be broadened and developed. A financial crimes expertise center. So the idea being, how do we start to work this cryptocurrency money laundering problem that is developing in the region? And then truly, it's a maritime environment. So how do we master and gain effective maritime domain awareness at the unclassified level to then share and enable those Pacific Islands to both self-police and to ask the right questions of the US intelligence process to then give them resources and capabilities in the region. Then it moves into a grant recommendations, so specifically criminal records management system. So there's a complex hodgepodge of information sharing processes. So how do we streamline that? How do we work towards that as a region? And then working towards intelligence, tasking, and queuing. So commercial capabilities, triangulation capabilities, or information sharing capabilities in the outlying regions. So that can look like communications infrastructure, triangulation infrastructure, or commercial satellite capabilities that can be shared or leveraged within the region to help effectively place and optimize resources in the Pacific. And then lastly is when you look at the space distance in the region, you start to see that there's a need for information communications infrastructure and reconnaissance systems. So how do you work towards the drone problem or autonomous things that can work the whole region together in a joint environment? That all kind of nests up into that regional fusion center, regional capabilities. When you look at the threat space, cyber is clearly prevalent, and there is very minimal infrastructure in the region for cyber. So I propose a conversation around a Marianas or Pacific Islands cyber protection team and an Oceania ISAC to help facilitate that information and help find best practices. And then, as I've mentioned, money laundering, a capability to work and detect a process within the region as they're all interconnected in the COFA agreements on the US currency and US financial system. So how do we correctly hedge against any threats that are developing in the region? So this thesis serves as a menu of policy options to support the newly released Pacific Partnership Strategy in the hopes that we can be true partners of the Pacific region, and specifically the FAS states. The physical border and virtual border extension within the FAS creates some very complex and very unique relationships that the U.S. needs to address and harden around. Australia has made measurable gains within the Pacific. The U.S. needs to understand those efforts in the law enforcement capacity space and both support and augment them within the FAS to try to create a comprehensive framework in the region and not compete with those efforts already underway. So the PIC region, the Pacific region, is an arc of opportunity, and the United States has significant influence in the region. So timing is critical for the U.S. to try to act, invest, and to support our closest Pacific friends, which are the FAS and the PIC countries, to ensure that the future of Oceania is a region of laws, responsible resource management, and individual freedoms as we advance what is the future of the Pacific. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoy the document.